scream came from inside the private chamber, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet halls of the palace like a blade. Guards froze at their posts. A maid dropped a tray of silver cups, and the sound of metal hitting marble echoed down the corridor. Duchess Elena Hartley stood in the middle of the room, her hand pressed against her stomach, staring at a folded letter that had fallen from her husband's coat pocket. Her face had gone pale, her breath caught somewhere between shock and fury. Just an hour earlier, the palace had been filled with laughter and music. Elena had been standing beside Duke Alexander Vance under a canopy of white flowers, her hand resting gently on the small curve of her belly, while hundreds of guests raised their glasses to celebrate the future heir to the Vance dukedom. She had never felt more loved, more certain of her place in the world. Now, standing alone with a single piece of paper in her trembling hand, that certainty was shattering into pieces. The letter was short. It did not need to be long to destroy everything. It spoke of stolen evenings, of promises made in secret, of a love that had never truly ended even after the wedding vows were spoken in front of the entire kingdom. It was signed with a single name Elena did not recognize, but somehow already understood: Charlotte. Elena sat down slowly on the edge of the velvet chair by the window, her knees suddenly weak. Outside, the garden was still decorated with ribbons and lanterns from the celebration. Children were still running between the hedges, unaware that inside the palace walls, a woman's entire world had just cracked open. She thought back to the early days of her marriage to Alexander, how gentle he had been, how attentive. He used to bring her flowers from the eastern gardens himself instead of sending a servant. He used to sit with her for hours listening to her talk about the small kingdom she came from before she married into royalty. She had believed, truly believed, that what they shared was real. Now she wondered how much of it had ever been true. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. It was Margaret Vance, the Duke's mother, her expression unreadable as always. Margaret had never fully accepted Elena, not from the very first day she arrived at the palace gates. She had always found small ways to remind Elena that she came from a lesser house, that she had married above her station. Now, looking at the letter still clutched in Elena's hand, something flickered across the older woman's face. It was not quite surprise. "You knew," Elena said quietly, her voice trembling. "Didn't you? You knew about her." Margaret did not answer right away. She walked slowly into the room and closed the door behind her, as if trying to keep the secret from spreading any further than it already had. "There are things in this family," she said carefully, "that are better left unspoken. For the sake of the dukedom, for the sake of the child you carry." Elena felt something harden inside her chest. "For the sake of the child," she repeated. "You mean for the sake of appearances?" She stood up, ignoring the slight dizziness that came with the sudden movement, and walked past Margaret toward the door. She needed air. She needed to see Alexander's face when she asked him the truth, because some small, foolish part of her still hoped there was an explanation, some way this could all be a terrible misunderstanding. She found him in his study, exactly where she expected. He was standing by the window, his back to the door, a glass of wine in his hand that he had not touched. When he turned and saw her standing there, saw the letter still in her fingers, his face went through a series of expressions so quickly that Elena almost could not follow them. Surprise, fear, and then, unmistakably, guilt. "Elena," he began, setting down the glass, "I can explain." "Then explain," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Tell me this is not what it looks like. Tell me Charlotte is nothing to you." The silence that followed was the loudest sound Elena had ever heard. Alexander opened his mouth to speak, closed it again, and ran a hand through his hair the way he always did when he was searching for words that did not exist. "It started before we were married," he finally said. "I thought it was over, I truly did, but it is complicated, Elena. There are things about my past, about my family's expectations, that you do not understand." "Then help me understand," Elena said, stepping closer. "Because right now what I understand is that I am standing in front of my husband, carrying his child, and he cannot even tell me that the woman in this letter means nothing to him." Alexander's silence answered the question more clearly than any words could have. Elena felt the room tilt slightly around her. She placed a hand on the back of a nearby chair to steady herself, breathing slowly, trying to keep her composure even as everything inside her wanted to break. She thought of the gala just hours earlier, of the crowd cheering for their happiness, of the future she had imagined so clearly. All of it now felt like a stage play she had been performing without knowing the real script. "I need air," she said finally, turning toward the door. "Elena, wait," Alexander called after her, but she did not stop. She walked out of the study, past the guards who did not know what to do with their eyes, past the portraits of past dukes and duchesses lining the long hallway, their painted faces watching her with silent judgment. She walked until she reached the private garden at the back of the palace, the one place she had always gone when the walls of the court felt too heavy to bear. The garden was empty at this hour, the celebration having moved to the grand hall. Elena sat on the stone bench beneath the old oak tree, the same tree where Alexander had once carved both their names during their courtship, back when everything between them had still felt simple and true. She looked at the initials now, faded slightly with time, and felt a strange, hollow ache in her chest. She was not naive. She had grown up hearing stories about political marriages, about dukes and duchesses who lived separate lives behind closed doors while presenting a united front to the public. She had simply never imagined that would be her story. She had believed, foolishly perhaps, that what she and Alexander shared was different. A soft rustle of leaves made her look up. It was Henry Cross, the palace's longtime steward, a kind older man who had served the Vance family for over 30 years. He had known Elena since the day she first arrived, nervous and unsure of herself in a palace far grander than anything she had known before. He was one of the few people in the palace who had never treated her differently because of where she came from. "Your Grace," he said gently, "the guests are asking after you." "Let them ask," Elena replied, her eyes still fixed on the carved initials on the tree. "Tonight I do not think I can smile for anyone." Henry did not press her further. He simply stood beside her in silence for a long moment, offering the kind of quiet comfort that required no words. Finally he spoke again, his voice careful. "Whatever has happened, Your Grace, you are not without allies within these walls. Do not forget that." Elena managed a small, grateful nod, though her mind was elsewhere, replaying every private smile Alexander had given her over the past year, wondering now which ones had been real, and which had simply been performances for a wife he no longer fully wanted. She placed a hand over her stomach again, feeling the small, steady flutter of movement inside her, a reminder that whatever happened between her and Alexander, there was now a life growing that depended on her strength. She could not fall apart. Not tonight, not with everything still uncertain. As she sat there beneath the oak tree, the first stars beginning to appear over the palace towers, Elena made a quiet decision. She would not confront Alexander again tonight, not in anger, not in tears. She would wait, watch, and learn the full truth before deciding what to do next. She owed herself that much. She owed her child that much. But as she rose from the bench and walked slowly back toward the lit windows of the palace, she could not shake the feeling that the life she had built here, the one she had been so proud of, was already beginning to crumble beneath her feet, and there was no going back to the woman she had been before she read that letter. Somewhere behind those glowing windows, Alexander was likely still standing in his study, staring at the door she had walked through, wondering what came next. Elena did not know it yet, but this single night, this single letter, would set into motion a chain of events that would change not just her life, but the future of the entire Vance dukedom, in ways none of them could yet imagine. The celebration continued inside the grand hall, music and laughter drifting out into the cool evening air, utterly unaware that the woman they had toasted just hours earlier was now standing in the shadows of the garden, carrying a secret that would soon shake the foundations of the palace itself. For now, Elena simply breathed, one hand on her stomach, the other brushing against the rough bark of the old oak tree, gathering whatever strength she had left before stepping back into a world that suddenly felt far less certain than it had that morning. The days that followed the gala moved slowly, each one heavier than the last. Elena tried to carry herself as she always had, greeting the household staff with the same warmth, attending to her duties as Duchess with the same quiet grace, but something had shifted inside her, something the sharpest eyes in the palace could not help but notice. She began paying closer attention to the small details she had once dismissed without thought. The way Alexander's phone would light up late at night, and he would step out onto the balcony to answer it, keeping his voice low. The way certain letters addressed to him never made it to the pile she usually helped sort through each morning. The way, when she asked about his schedule, his answers had grown vague where they used to be precise. She told herself these were small things, easily explained. A duke had many responsibilities, many people demanding his attention. She reminded herself of this every time doubt crept back into her mind, though the reminder grew weaker with each passing day. One afternoon, while walking through the east wing toward the library, Elena overheard two maids speaking in hushed voices near the linen closet. They stopped the moment they saw her, offering quick curtsies and polite smiles, but not before Elena caught a fragment of their conversation, enough to send a cold chill down her spine. They had been speaking about a woman who visited the palace grounds sometimes, always through the side entrance, always when the Duke was expected to be alone. Elena said nothing to them. She simply nodded and continued on her way, though her heart was pounding hard against her ribs. She did not confront Alexander that evening either. Instead, she began to watch more carefully, to listen more closely, gathering pieces of a puzzle she was terrified to see completed. The visitor arrived without warning just past noon, dressed in a simple gray coat that did nothing to hide her nervous energy. Elena watched from the upper balcony as the woman was led through the side entrance by one of the younger guards, her face partially covered by a scarf, her steps quick and practiced, as though she had walked this path many times before. Elena's stomach tightened. She recognized the coat, she recognized the walk. This was Charlotte. Elena did not rush downstairs. She did not want to give Alexander the satisfaction of seeing her panic, nor did she want to create a scene that would humiliate her in front of the staff before she had all the facts. Instead, she waited, watching the small side door that led to Alexander's private study, counting the minutes as they stretched into an hour, then two. When Charlotte finally left through the same side entrance, her scarf pulled even tighter around her face, Elena felt something inside her go cold and still. There was no longer room for doubt. She walked calmly to her chambers, closed the door, and sat by the window overlooking the garden, staring at nothing in particular, trying to steady the storm building inside her chest. She thought about her own mother, a woman who had endured a difficult marriage of her own, who had once told Elena that a lady of the court must learn to smile through pain because the world was always watching. Elena had never wanted to be that kind of woman. She had promised herself, long before she ever wore the title of Duchess, that she would never stay silent in the face of betrayal. That evening she waited for Alexander in the private dining room, the table set for two as it always was, candles flickering between them though neither of them touched the food. Alexander arrived late, his expression tired, his eyes avoiding hers the moment he sat down. "You had a visitor today," Elena said, her voice calm, deliberately calm, the kind of calm that came from years of learning to hide her true feelings behind a composed face. Alexander's hand paused over his wine glass. "Elena, it is not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," she said, leaning forward slightly. "Because from where I sit it looks exactly like what I think. A woman entering through a side door, staying for 2 hours, leaving with her face hidden. Tell me I am wrong, Alexander. I would very much like to be wrong." He set down his glass, his jaw tightening. For a long moment he said nothing, and in that silence, Elena felt something inside her finally break free of the last thread of hope she had been holding onto. "She came to discuss something private," he finally said. "A family matter that has nothing to do with you." "A family matter," Elena repeated slowly. "Alexander, I found a letter. I know her name. I know what she means to you, or at least what she once meant to you. Please do not insult me by pretending I am imagining things." Alexander's composure finally cracked. He pushed back from the table, running both hands through his hair, pacing toward the window with his back to her. "You do not understand the pressure I am under," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "My mother expects certain things. The council expects certain things. There are arrangements that were made long before you and I ever met. Arrangements I have tried to untangle myself from for years." "Arrangements," Elena said, standing now as well, her hands trembling though her voice remained steady. "Is that what you call it? An arrangement? I am your wife, Alexander. I am carrying your child. And you speak to me of arrangements as though I am a business partner you owe an explanation to, rather than the woman who trusted you with her entire life." He turned to face her then, and for the briefest moment, Elena saw something close to regret in his eyes. But regret was not the same as honesty, and honesty was the only thing she wanted from him now. "Tell me the truth," she said quietly. "All of it, no more half answers. No more excuses about family pressure. Is Charlotte still part of your life, or is she not?" The silence stretched painfully long before Alexander finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "It is complicated." Elena felt her heart shatter at those 3 words, spoken so quietly, so carefully, as though he believed that softening his tone could somehow soften the blow of what he was truly admitting. "Complicated," she repeated, shaking her head slowly. "There is nothing complicated about loyalty, Alexander. Either you were faithful to me or you were not. Either this child I carry grows up with a father who chose his family over old promises, or he grows up hearing whispers about a mother who was never enough. That is not fair, Alexander said, his voice rising slightly. You do not know everything about my past, about the promises made before I even knew you existed. Then make me understand, Elena said, her own voice rising to match his. Because right now, all I understand is that my husband has been keeping secrets from me since before our wedding, and I am the last person in this palace to learn the truth. It was then that Margaret appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices, her expression carefully composed as always, though Elena could see the flicker of concern beneath the surface. This is not the place for such conversations, Margaret said smoothly. The staff will hear. Let them hear, Elena said, turning to face her mother-in-law with a fierceness that surprised even herself. Let the entire palace hear the truth for once, instead of the polished lies we present at every gala and every dinner. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, though her voice remained even. Elena, you are upset, and understandably so, but making a scene will not help your position here. My position, Elena said, laughing bitterly. You mean my usefulness. As long as I smile and stand beside your son at public events, I am useful. The moment I ask for honesty, suddenly I am the problem. Alexander stepped forward, reaching for her hand, but Elena pulled away before he could touch her. Do not, she said quietly. Do not touch me until you are ready to tell me the whole truth. She left the dining room without looking back, her steps quick despite the ache in her chest, making her way to her private chambers where she could finally allow the tears to fall without an audience. She sat on the edge of her bed, one hand resting protectively over her stomach, and allowed herself, for the first time since the gala, to truly grieve the marriage she had believed in so completely. Over the following days, the palace grew tense with unspoken words. Servants moved quietly through the halls, careful not to draw attention to themselves, sensing the storm brewing beneath the surface of polite formality. Elena continued her duties as Duchess, attending meetings with the household staff, reviewing plans for the nursery, greeting visiting dignitaries with practiced grace, though her heart was no longer in any of it. She began spending more time with Henry Cross, finding comfort in his steady presence and his willingness to speak honestly with her, even when the truth was uncomfortable. It was Henry who eventually told her, gently and with clear reluctance, that Charlotte was not simply a figure from Alexander's past. She has visited more than once, Your Grace, Henry admitted one evening, his voice low as they walked together through the quiet garden. Not often and always quietly, but this is not the first time, nor I fear will it be the last, unless something changes. Elena absorbed this information silently, feeling the last remnants of denial finally give way to a clear, painful understanding. She was not simply dealing with a mistake from Alexander's past. She was dealing with an ongoing betrayal, one that had continued even as he stood beside her at their wedding, even as he celebrated the news of her pregnancy in front of the entire kingdom. Thank you for telling me the truth, Henry, she said quietly. Not everyone in this palace has been so honest with me. You deserve honesty, Your Grace, Henry replied. More than most people who have worn that title before you. That night, Elena sat alone in the nursery that was being prepared for her child, running her hand along the edge of the small crib that had been carved from pale wood, decorated with delicate carvings of birds and flowers. She had imagined, so many times, rocking her baby to sleep in this very room, with Alexander standing beside her, both of them united in the joy of building a family together. Now that image felt impossibly distant, replaced by a growing certainty that she would need to find her own strength, separate from any promises Alexander had once made her. She thought about her options carefully, weighing each one against the life growing inside her. She could stay, endure the whispered rumors and the quiet betrayals, raise her child within these palace walls under the constant shadow of Alexander's divided loyalties. Or she could leave, step away from the title and the security it offered, and build something new, something honest, even if it meant starting from nothing. Neither choice felt easy, neither choice felt entirely right, but as she sat there in the quiet nursery feeling her child move gently within her, Elena understood one thing with absolute clarity. She would not raise her son or daughter in a home built on secrets and half-truths. Whatever came next, she needed the full truth first, no matter how much it might cost her. She resolved in that quiet moment to confront Alexander one final time, to demand complete honesty before deciding what her future and her child's future would truly look like. The study door was locked when Alina tried it the next morning, an unusual thing in a palace where doors were rarely closed against family. She knocked once firmly, and when no answer came, she used the small brass key she still carried from the early days of her marriage, back when Alexander had trusted her completely with every corner of his private world. The room was empty, but the desk told a story of its own. Papers were scattered across its surface in a way that suggested Alexander had left in a hurry, and among them, Alina found a leather folder she did not recognize. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, unsure whether she truly wanted to know what secrets it held, yet unable to stop herself from looking. Inside were more letters, dated across several months, some recent enough to have been written after her wedding to Alexander. There were also documents, official-looking papers with a family crest she did not recognize, along with a name that appeared several times throughout the folder, Charlotte Bell. Beside her name in smaller print was another detail that made Alina's breath catch in her throat, a due date only 2 months behind her own. Alina sat down heavily in Alexander's chair, the folder trembling in her hands as the full weight of the truth settled over her. This was not simply an old affair lingering in the shadows of his past. Charlotte was carrying his child as well, a child conceived during the very time Alina had believed her own marriage to be strong and secure. She did not know how long she sat there, staring at the papers, before the sound of footsteps in the hallway startled her back to the present. She quickly gathered the folder together, uncertain whether to confront Alexander immediately or wait until she had fully composed herself. Before she could decide, the study door opened, and Alexander stepped inside, freezing the moment he saw her sitting at his desk, the folder clutched tightly in her hands. "Alina," he said carefully, closing the door behind him. "You should not be in here." "Why not?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Are there more secrets hidden in this room that you would rather I never find?" Alexander's eyes moved to the folder in her hands, and Alina watched the color drain from his face as he understood exactly what she had discovered. He crossed the room slowly, as though approaching a wounded animal, his hands raised slightly in a gesture meant to be calming, though nothing about this moment felt calm to Alina. "Let me explain," he said. "You keep saying that," Alina replied, standing up from the chair, her legs unsteady but her resolve firm. "Let me explain, it is complicated, you do not understand. I am tired of excuses, Alexander, I want facts. Is this true? Is Charlotte carrying your child?" The silence that followed was answer enough, but Alexander nodded slowly regardless, as though forcing himself to finally speak the truth aloud after months, perhaps years, of avoiding it. "Yes," he said quietly, "it is true." Alina felt the room spin slightly, but she forced herself to remain standing, refusing to give him the satisfaction of watching her collapse under the weight of his betrayal. "How long?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "How long has this been happening, Alexander? Since before our wedding, during our engagement? Tell me the truth, all of it, right now." Alexander sank into the chair across from the desk, burying his face briefly in his hands before looking up at her, his eyes filled with something that might have been shame, though Alina no longer trusted herself to read his emotions accurately. "Charlotte and I were together long before I met you," he began. "My mother never approved of the match, said her family did not have the standing necessary for a future duke. I ended things when our engagement was arranged, or I believed I had ended things. But when tensions grew between our two families over trade agreements last year, my mother suggested reconnecting with Charlotte's family to smooth things over. I never intended for it to become what it became." "You never intended," Alina repeated, shaking her head slowly. "As if this simply happened to you, as though you had no choice in any of it. You made choices, Alexander. Every single time you met with her, every letter you wrote, every moment you chose her over honesty with me, those were choices you made." "You are right," Alexander admitted quietly. "I am not trying to excuse what I have done. I am simply trying to explain how it began, because you deserve to understand the full picture." Alina walked slowly toward the window, needing distance between herself and the man she had once trusted completely. Outside, the palace grounds looked exactly as they always had. Gardeners tending to the hedges, guards patrolling the outer walls, everything appearing perfectly normal despite the devastation unfolding inside these walls. "Does your mother know," Alina asked without turning around, "that Charlotte is carrying your child?" "Yes," Alexander admitted. "She has known for several weeks." Alina closed her eyes briefly, absorbing this final piece of the puzzle. Margaret had watched Elena continue to trust her husband, continue to plan for their child's future, all while knowing the truth that would shatter everything. The betrayal suddenly felt larger than just Alexander's infidelity. It felt like an entire family had conspired to keep her in the dark. "What happens now?" Elena asked, finally turning to face him again. Two children born within months of each other to two different mothers, both connected to the Vance dukedom. Have you thought about what that means, Alexander? For the succession, for the kingdom, for the two children who will grow up carrying the weight of your choices. Alexander's expression showed that he had in fact thought about very little beyond his own guilt and his fear of losing everything at once. "My mother has suggested that Charlotte's child, if it is a son, could be recognized as a secondary heir, given a lesser title, provided under the family's protection but without full succession rights. She believes it can be managed quietly, without public scandal." Elena stared at him, disbelief written clearly across her face. "Managed quietly," she repeated. "You are speaking about children, Alexander, real children who will grow up knowing their fathers chose convenience and reputation over honesty and love. There is no quiet way to manage that kind of pain." She thought suddenly of her own child, still growing safely within her, and felt a fierce protectiveness rise up inside her chest. She would not allow her son or daughter to grow up in a household built on secrets, competing silently with another child for their father's limited attention and approval. She would not allow her child to become a pawn in whatever political game Alexander and his mother believed they could quietly manage. "I need time," Elena said finally, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Time to think about what I want, what is best for my child, separate from whatever arrangement you and your mother have already begun planning without my knowledge or consent." "Elena, please," Alexander said, standing and moving toward her. "I know I have hurt you deeply, more than I ever intended, but we can find a way through this together. I do not want to lose you or our child." "You should have thought about that before you chose secrets over honesty," Elena replied, stepping back from his outstretched hand. "I am not ready to discuss solutions, Alexander. Right now I simply need distance, and I need you to respect that." She left the study without waiting for his response, walking quickly through the palace halls toward her own chambers, her mind racing through everything she had just learned. The scope of the betrayal was far larger than she had initially understood, involving not just Alexander's broken promises, but an entire family's willingness to sacrifice her happiness and her child's future stability for the sake of political convenience and reputation. Over the following days, Elena withdrew from public palace life as much as her position allowed, canceling several scheduled appearances, citing pregnancy-related exhaustion as her excuse. In truth, she spent much of her time in quiet reflection, walking through the gardens alone, sitting for long hours in the nursery, trying to imagine what kind of future she truly wanted for herself and her child. She began cautiously to explore what life outside the palace might actually look like. She contacted a distant cousin who lived in a small town several hours from the capital, a woman named Sophie who had always been kind to Elena during rare family visits before her marriage. Sophie's letters, once Elena reached out, were warm and welcoming, offering support without judgment, a stark contrast to the calculated coldness Elena had grown used to within palace walls. She also began quietly setting aside small amounts of money from her personal allowance, understanding that if she truly decided to leave, she would need resources of her own, separate from anything tied to the Vance family name. It felt strange, almost surreal, to be planning an escape from a life she had once dreamed of living, but with each passing day, Elena felt more certain that staying within a marriage built on betrayal was not a future she could accept, not for herself, and certainly not for her child. Margaret, sensing the growing distance between Elena and Alexander, attempted several times to speak with her privately, offering what she likely believed were reasonable compromises. She spoke of family reputation, of the importance of presenting a united front to the public, of the practical benefits Elena would enjoy by remaining Duchess despite the personal difficulties within her marriage. Elena listened politely each time, offering no commitments, no agreements, simply nodding along while privately growing more certain that Margaret's version of reasonable compromise involved Elena quietly accepting humiliation in exchange for continued status and comfort. "You must think of the child," Margaret said during one such conversation, her tone carrying the weight of practiced persuasion. "A child needs stability, needs the security that comes with the Vance name and the resources this family provides." A child also needs honesty, Elena replied evenly. And parents who do not ask them to grow up pretending everything is fine when it clearly is not. Margaret's expression tightened slightly at this response, though she said nothing further on the matter that day, seeming to understand that Elena was not as easily persuaded as she had perhaps hoped. As the weeks passed, Elena's resolve continued to strengthen, even as her heart still ached from the depth of Alexander's betrayal. She began to understand that leaving the palace would not simply be an act of anger or impulsive emotion, but a deliberate choice to build a life defined by honesty and self-respect, values she refused to compromise, even for the security and status that came with her current position. She had not yet made a final decision, had not yet spoken the words aloud that would set her departure into motion, but with each quiet evening spent in the nursery, each conversation with Henry that reaffirmed her worth beyond her royal title, each letter exchanged with her cousin Sophie describing the simple, honest life available outside these palace walls, Elena felt herself moving steadily toward a choice that would change everything. The council chamber had never felt so cold to Elena as it did the morning Margaret called an urgent family meeting, insisting that Elena attend despite her continued withdrawal from palace affairs. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust particles floating in the air, but nothing about the room felt warm or welcoming as Elena took her seat at the long table across from Alexander and his mother. "We must discuss the future," Margaret began without preamble, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "The council has grown aware of certain rumors, and it is only a matter of time before the full situation becomes public knowledge. We need a unified plan before that happens." Elena remained silent, watching Alexander carefully. He looked exhausted, dark circles beneath his eyes suggesting sleepless nights, though Elena found it difficult to feel much sympathy given the circumstances he had created for himself. "What kind of plan?" Elena finally asked, though she suspected she already knew the shape of what Margaret intended to propose. "Charlotte's child, when born, will be given a title befitting an acknowledged relation to the ducal family, though not a claim to succession," Margaret explained smoothly, as though discussing routine palace business rather than the lives of two innocent children. "Your child, Elena, will remain the primary heir. Charlotte herself will be provided for quietly, in a residence away from the capital, ensuring minimal public exposure. This arrangement allows the family to maintain its reputation, while providing appropriately for all parties involved." Elena stared at her mother-in-law, genuinely stunned by the calculated coldness of the proposal. "All parties involved," she repeated slowly. "You mean two children who will grow up knowing their father chose to hide one of them away like an inconvenient secret. You mean a woman who will spend her life in quiet exile because acknowledging her openly would embarrass this family. You call this a reasonable plan?" "It is the most practical solution given the circumstances," Margaret replied, her tone unwavering. "The alternative is public scandal, which serves no one, least of all you or your child." Elena turned to look at Alexander, searching his face for any sign of disagreement with his mother's proposal, any indication that he found this arrangement as troubling as she did. Instead, she found only weary resignation, as though he had already accepted this as the inevitable path forward. "Is this truly what you want, Alexander?" she asked quietly. "For your children to grow up as pieces in a carefully managed public image, rather than as people who deserve honesty and genuine care from their father?" "I do not know what else to do, Elena," he admitted, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I have made terrible mistakes, and now I am simply trying to find a path forward that causes the least amount of damage to everyone involved." "The least amount of damage to the family reputation, you mean," Elena said, standing abruptly from her chair. "Not to the people who will actually live with the consequences of these decisions." She left the council chamber without waiting for a response, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and heartbreak. She understood now, with complete clarity, that Alexander had chosen the path of least resistance, allowing his mother to design a solution that protected the family's public image while doing nothing to address the genuine harm caused by his betrayal. That evening, Elena requested a private meeting with Alexander in the small sitting room adjacent to her chambers, away from Margaret's watchful presence and the formal atmosphere of the council chamber. She needed to speak with him directly, one final time, before making her decision about the future. Alexander arrived looking uncertain, perhaps sensing that this conversation would prove decisive in ways their previous discussions had not. He sat across from her, waiting for her to speak first, and Alina took a moment to gather her thoughts before finally breaking the silence. "I have spent the past several weeks trying to understand how we arrived at this point," she began. "I have asked myself repeatedly whether there was something I could have done differently, some way I could have been a better wife that would have kept you from turning back to Charlotte. But I have realized something important, Alexander. This was never about anything I did or did not do. This was about choices you made repeatedly over many months, choices that had nothing to do with me." Alexander opened his mouth to respond, but Alina raised her hand gently, asking for the space to finish her thoughts. "I cannot build a life within a family that views honesty as optional, that treats children as political arrangements to be managed, rather than people to be loved openly and completely. I cannot raise my child in a household where secrets are the foundation upon which everything else is built. I have made my decision, Alexander. I am leaving the palace." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than Alina had anticipated, though speaking them aloud brought a strange sense of relief alongside the sorrow. Alexander's face crumbled slightly, genuine anguish visible for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun. "Alina, please," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "I know I have failed you, failed us, in ways I cannot fully express how deeply I regret, but leaving will not undo what has happened. It will only mean our child grows up without a father present in their daily life. Our child will grow up knowing their mother chose honesty and self-respect over comfort and convenience," Alina replied firmly. "That is a lesson I want them to learn, even if it means a more difficult path in the beginning." "Where will you go?" Alexander asked quietly. "How will you manage, away from the resources and protection the palace provides?" "I have a cousin who has offered me a place to stay," Alina said. "I have some resources of my own, and I am prepared to work to build something honest, even if it is smaller and simpler than the life I have known here. I would rather have peace and integrity than status built on lies." Alexander sat in silence for a long moment, processing her words, and Alina watched as something shifted in his expression, moving from desperate pleading toward a more resigned acceptance. "I will not stop you," he finally said. "Though I wish with everything in me that circumstances were different, that I had made different choices long before any of this became necessary." "So do I," Alina said softly, the anger in her voice giving way briefly to genuine sorrow for the marriage she had believed in so completely. "But wishing does not change what has already happened. I need to focus now on building a stable, honest future for my child, and I cannot do that here." They sat together in silence for several minutes, the weight of the conversation settling over the room like a heavy fog. Finally, Alexander spoke again, his voice quiet but sincere. "Whatever you need, Alina, financially or otherwise, I want you to have it. This is not your fault, and our child should not suffer for my mistakes." "I appreciate that," Alina replied, though she remained uncertain how much of that promise would actually be honored once Margaret became involved in the details. "I will need time to prepare for the transition, but I intend to leave within the next few weeks." Word of Alina's decision spread quickly through the palace staff, though never officially announced, carried instead through quiet whispers and knowing glances exchanged between servants who had grown fond of the Duchess during her time within these walls. Henry Cross found Alina in the garden one afternoon shortly after her conversation with Alexander, his expression carrying a mixture of sadness and quiet pride. "I have heard you intend to leave us, Your Grace," he said gently. "News travels quickly within these walls," Alina replied with a small, tired smile. "It does," Henry agreed. "I want you to know, whatever path you choose, you have shown more courage in these past weeks than most people demonstrate in a lifetime. Your child will be fortunate to have a mother who values honesty and integrity above comfort and status." Alina felt tears well up in her eyes at his words, grateful for the genuine kindness he had shown her throughout this difficult ordeal. "Thank you, Henry. Your friendship has meant more to me than you know, especially during these past several weeks. If you ever need anything, Your Grace, please do not hesitate to reach out," Henry said. "Some of us within these walls remember what genuine kindness looks like, even within a family that has sometimes forgotten." Alina spent the following days quietly preparing for her departure, packing only what truly belonged to her, leaving behind the jewels and formal gowns that felt more like symbols of a life she was leaving than possessions she genuinely wanted to keep. She wrote a careful letter to Sophie, confirming her arrival date, and made arrangements for a private car to take her away from the capital without drawing unnecessary public attention. Margaret attempted one final conversation before Elena's departure, cornering her in the hallway outside the nursery, her expression carrying a rare hint of genuine concern beneath the usual calculated composure. "You are making a mistake," she said firmly. "Leaving will not solve anything. It will only complicate matters further for you and for the child." "Perhaps," Elena replied evenly. "But it is my mistake to make, and I would rather live with the consequences of my own honest choices than remain trapped within a life built entirely on your family's carefully constructed lies." Margaret said nothing further, though something in her expression suggested, however briefly, a flicker of respect for Elena's unwavering resolve. Elena did not wait to see whether that respect would translate into any genuine change of heart. She had made her decision, and nothing remained now except to follow through with the difficult but necessary path she had chosen for herself and her unborn child. The morning of Elena's departure arrived gray and quiet, mist still clinging to the palace grounds as she carried her final bag toward the small car waiting near the side entrance, the same entrance Charlotte had once used to slip in and out unnoticed. There was a certain painful irony in that detail, one Elena tried not to dwell on as she took a last look at the towering palace walls that had been her home for the past several years. Alexander stood nearby, having insisted on seeing her off despite Elena's initial hesitation about allowing him this final moment. He looked older somehow, the weight of recent weeks etched clearly into the lines of his face, though Elena reminded herself firmly that sympathy for his suffering could not undo the choices that had led them both to this moment. "I wish things had been different," Alexander said quietly, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets against the morning chill. "So do I," Elena replied honestly, "but wishing will not change the path we now must walk separately." "You will let me know," he asked, his voice carrying a note of genuine desperation, "when the child is born. You will not shut me out entirely." Elena considered this for a long moment, weighing her lingering anger against the practical reality that this child would always be connected to Alexander, regardless of the circumstances of their parents' separation. "I will let you know," she finally agreed. "Our child deserves the chance to know their father, even if their parents cannot remain married. But do not mistake this for reconciliation, Alexander. This is simply about doing what is right for our child." He nodded, seeming to understand and accept the boundaries she had set, and for a brief moment, something close to the old warmth passed between them, a final echo of the connection they had once shared before everything fell apart. Elena climbed into the car without further words, watching through the window as the palace grew smaller behind her, until finally it disappeared entirely from view, swallowed by the winding road and the surrounding hills. The journey to Sophie's town took several hours, giving Elena ample time to reflect on everything that had happened over the past weeks, and to imagine, with cautious hope, the shape her new life might take. She had never lived independently before, had moved directly from her family's modest estate into palace life upon her marriage to Alexander, and the uncertainty of building something entirely her own felt both terrifying and strangely liberating. Sophie welcomed her warmly upon arrival, embracing Elena tightly despite the awkwardness of her pregnant belly between them, ushering her into a small but comfortable home on the edge of a quiet town called Ashford Hollow. The house was nothing like the palace Elena had left behind: simple furniture, modest rooms, walls without portraits of stern ancestors watching her every move, but something about its simplicity felt immediately more honest than anything she had experienced in years. "You are welcome here for as long as you need," Sophie said, helping Elena settle into the small guest room that would become her own space for the coming months. "No questions asked, no expectations beyond simply taking care of yourself and that baby." Elena felt genuine gratitude wash over her, along with the first real sense of peace she had experienced since discovering Alexander's letter weeks earlier. "Thank you, Sophie. I do not know how I would have managed this without your kindness." The following weeks brought a period of adjustment, unlike anything Elena had previously experienced. She learned to manage a household budget for the first time in her adult life, learned to cook simple meals rather than relying on palace kitchen staff, learned to fill her days with purposeful activity rather than the formal obligations that had structured her previous existence. It was humbling in many ways, but also unexpectedly freeing, allowing her to discover strengths and capabilities she had never needed to develop within the sheltered confines of palace life. She began working part-time at a small medical clinic in town, helping with administrative tasks and greeting patients, a position Sophie had helped arrange through her connections within the local community. The clinic was run primarily by a kind, soft-spoken doctor named Daniel Moore, a man in his early 30s who had returned to his hometown several years earlier after completing his medical training in the capital. Daniel treated Elena with a straightforward respect that felt refreshingly different from the careful, calculated interactions she had grown accustomed to within palace circles. He never asked prying questions about her past, never seemed to recognize her from the occasional newspaper coverage of royal events, simply accepted her as Elena, a capable new employee navigating a difficult pregnancy alone. "You handle the front desk better than anyone I have hired in years," Daniel commented one afternoon, several weeks into her employment, as they worked together to reorganize the clinic's filing system. "Most people would be overwhelmed by the chaos here, but you seem to find order in it naturally." "I have had practice managing complicated situations recently," Elena replied with a small, wry smile, though she offered no further explanation, and Daniel, sensing her reluctance to elaborate, did not press for details. Their working relationship gradually developed into a genuine friendship, built on mutual respect, and the kind of easy conversation that came naturally when neither person felt the need to perform for the other. Daniel would often walk Elena home after long shifts at the clinic, their conversations ranging from town gossip to Daniel's genuine passion for medicine, to Elena's growing excitement about her approaching due date. "Have you decided on names yet?" Daniel asked one evening as they walked slowly through the quiet streets of Ashford Hollow, the setting sun casting long shadows across the cobblestone path. "I have a few ideas," Elena admitted, "though nothing feels quite settled yet. I suppose I am waiting to meet them first to see which name feels right." "That seems wise," Daniel said thoughtfully. "Names carry a lot of weight. Better to choose carefully than to rush the decision." Elena appreciated his patience, his willingness to simply listen without offering unsolicited opinions or judgments about her situation. It was such a small thing, perhaps, but after months of navigating Margaret's calculated manipulations and Alexander's tangled half-truths, Daniel's straightforward honesty felt like a genuine gift. As her pregnancy progressed further, Elena found herself growing increasingly comfortable in her new life, despite the underlying uncertainty about what the future held. She exchanged occasional letters with Alexander, brief and businesslike, updating him on her health and the pregnancy's progress, though she carefully avoided any language that might suggest openness to reconciliation. He, in turn, kept his responses similarly measured, though Elena could sense, even through the formal written words, a growing regret that seemed to deepen with each passing month. Meanwhile, back at the palace, tensions continued to build as word of the pending scandal involving Charlotte's pregnancy began to leak beyond the palace walls, despite Margaret's best efforts to maintain secrecy. Newspapers began publishing speculative articles, careful not to name names directly but clearly hinting at trouble within the ducal household. Council members grew increasingly concerned about the potential damage to the family's public standing, and Margaret found herself fielding difficult questions from allies and rivals alike, her carefully constructed plans beginning to unravel despite her best efforts at damage control. Alexander, for his part, found himself increasingly isolated within the palace, caught between his mother's continued insistence on managing the situation quietly and his own growing awareness that Elena's departure had fundamentally changed how he viewed the choices he had made. He began spending long hours alone in his study, staring at old photographs from his wedding day, wondering how he had allowed his life to unravel so completely from the future he had once imagined. Back in Ashford Hollow, Elena continued building her new life with quiet determination, finding unexpected joy in the simple rhythms of her days, the satisfaction of honest work, the comfort of genuine friendships built without pretense or political calculation. She began to realize with each passing week that leaving the palace had not simply been an act of necessary self-protection, but the first step toward discovering a version of herself she had never fully known existed, independent, capable, and increasingly at peace with the difficult choices she had made. Late one evening, as autumn began settling over Ashford Hollow with cooler winds and earlier sunsets, Elena sat on the small porch outside Sophie's home, one hand resting on her rounded belly, feeling the strong, steady movements of her child within her. She thought about the palace she had left behind, about Alexander and Margaret and the complicated web of secrets that had once defined her daily existence, and found herself surprised by how distant and unfamiliar that world now felt, even after only a few months away. She thought too about Daniel, about the easy warmth of their growing friendship, though she was careful not to allow her mind to wander too far into territory that felt premature given her current circumstances. There would be time enough, she told herself, to consider what her heart truly wanted once her child was safely born, and she had fully settled into this new chapter of her life. For now, she simply allowed herself to feel grateful for Sophie's generous hospitality, for Daniel's genuine friendship, for the growing life within her that represented hope for a future built on honesty rather than carefully managed secrets. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, Elena felt increasingly confident in her ability to face them, no longer as a sheltered Duchess dependent on palace protection, but as a strong, independent woman capable of building a genuine, honest life for herself and her child. Winter arrived early in Ashford Hollow that year, blanketing the small town in a layer of frost that made the cobblestone streets glisten under the pale morning sun. Elena had grown accustomed to the rhythms of this simpler life, though the approaching birth of her child brought a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation that grew stronger with each passing week. She continued working at the clinic as long as Daniel would allow, though he grew increasingly protective as her due date approached, insisting she take more frequent breaks and reducing her hours despite her mild protests that she felt perfectly capable of continuing her usual pace. His concern, Elena had come to realize, stemmed not simply from professional caution as her employer, but from something deeper that neither of them had yet openly acknowledged. "You do not need to hover so much," Elena teased one afternoon, watching Daniel reorganize the same stack of files for the third time simply to remain near her desk. "I promise I will tell you if something feels wrong." "Forgive me for being cautious," Daniel replied with a small smile. "I have delivered enough babies in this town to know that caution rarely proves unnecessary." Elena laughed softly, appreciating the genuine warmth behind his teasing concern. Over the months, their friendship had deepened into something Elena found difficult to name precisely, though she recognized the growing comfort she felt in his presence, the way her worries seemed to ease simply from spending time in his company. She reminded herself regularly that she was in no position to consider romantic possibilities, not while still legally married to Alexander, not while still processing the pain of her broken marriage, but some quiet part of her heart continued to notice the careful, genuine kindness Daniel showed her every single day. One particularly difficult evening, Elena received a letter from Alexander that shook the careful peace she had built over the preceding months. Charlotte had given birth to a healthy son, the letter explained, and the council had formally recognized the child with a lesser title, exactly as Margaret had originally proposed. Alexander wrote with obvious emotional exhaustion, describing the strain of managing two families, the constant pressure from council members demanding clarity about succession, and his own uncertainty about how to move forward given the complicated circumstances he had created. Elena read the letter twice, sitting alone in her small bedroom, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions she had not fully anticipated. There was no longer any active jealousy, she realized, no lingering desire to reclaim the marriage she had once believed in so completely. Instead, she felt a quiet sadness for the two children now growing up within such a complicated, politically calculated family structure, and a renewed gratitude for her own decision to build a simpler, more honest life away from that environment. She wrote back to Alexander that same evening, keeping her tone measured and practical, acknowledging the news about his son with Charlotte while gently reminding him of her own approaching due date, and her continued desire to maintain clear boundaries between their separate lives. She signed the letter simply, without the warmth that had once characterized their correspondence during happier times, a small but significant reminder of how thoroughly their relationship had transformed. The following week, Elena's contractions began late one evening, arriving with an intensity that left little doubt about what was happening. Sophie helped her quickly to the clinic, where Daniel was waiting, having been alerted by an urgent message sent ahead by a neighbor's quick thinking. The birth itself proved long and difficult, stretching through the entire night and into the early morning hours, but Daniel remained steady and reassuring throughout, his calm competence providing Elena with exactly the stability she needed during the most physically demanding experience of her life. When her daughter finally arrived, just as the first light of dawn began filtering through the clinic windows, Elena felt an overwhelming rush of love unlike anything she had previously experienced. She held her daughter close, marveling at the small, perfect features, the tiny fingers wrapping instinctively around her own, and felt, for the first time in many months, a sense of complete and uncomplicated joy. "She is beautiful," Daniel said softly, standing nearby as Elena cradled her newborn daughter, his voice carrying genuine warmth and admiration. "What will you name her?" Elena looked down at her daughter's peaceful face, considering the question carefully before finally speaking the name that had been quietly forming in her mind over recent weeks. "Isabel," she said softly. "Isabel Hartley." She had chosen deliberately to give her daughter her own family name rather than the Vance name, a small but meaningful declaration of the independent life she intended to build for both herself and her child, separate from the complicated legacy of the ducal family she had left behind. News of Isabel's birth spread quickly through Ashford Hollow, with neighbors and clinic patients alike offering warm congratulations and small gifts for the new baby. Elena found herself genuinely touched by the community's generosity, a stark contrast to the calculated political interactions that had characterized so much of her palace life. Here, in this small town, people seemed to celebrate simply for the joy of new life, without ulterior motives or hidden agendas. She wrote to Alexander shortly after Isabel's birth, informing him of his daughter's arrival and health, though she remained careful to maintain the boundaries she had established regarding their separate lives. Alexander responded with evident emotion, expressing genuine joy at the news while also acknowledging, with what appeared to be sincere regret, his understanding that Elena's decision to build her life away from the palace remained firm and unlikely to change. As the weeks passed, and Elena settled into the demanding but deeply rewarding rhythms of new motherhood, her friendship with Daniel continued deepening in ways that felt increasingly significant. He visited regularly to check on Isabel's health, though Elena suspected, with a small private smile, that these visits had become as much about seeing her as they were about professional medical care. One quiet evening, several months after Isabel's birth, as Daniel sat with Elena on Sophie's small porch watching the baby sleep peacefully in her arms, he finally spoke words that had clearly been building for quite some time. "I know your situation remains complicated," he began carefully, his usual confidence tempered by evident nervousness. "I know you are still navigating decisions about your marriage, about your future. But I want you to know, Elena, that whatever happens, whatever you decide, I care for you deeply. Not simply as a friend, though I value that friendship immensely, but as someone I have come to love." Elena felt her heart swell with a complicated mixture of joy and uncertainty at his words. She had known, on some level, that her own feelings for Daniel had grown beyond simple friendship, but hearing him speak so openly and honestly about his own emotions felt both wonderful and slightly overwhelming given her still unresolved legal marriage to Alexander. "Daniel," she said softly, "I care for you too, more than I probably should admit given my current circumstances. But I am still legally married, still navigating the practical realities of separating from Alexander. I do not want to build something new on an uncertain foundation." "I understand," Daniel replied gently. "I am not asking for anything beyond patience and honesty. Take whatever time you need to sort through your circumstances with Alexander. I will still be here, Elena, whenever you are ready, if you are ever ready." Elena felt tears well up in her eyes at his patient understanding, grateful beyond words for a man who offered genuine love without pressure or demands, such a stark contrast to the complicated, secretive relationships that had defined her previous experience of romantic partnership. She reached for his hand, holding it gently while Isabel continued sleeping peacefully in her other arm. "Thank you, Daniel," she said quietly, "for your patience, for your honesty, for simply being exactly who you are." That evening marked a quiet but significant turning point in Elena's new life, a moment where the possibility of genuine happiness began feeling less like a distant, uncertain hope, and more like an achievable reality she could actively work toward, once she had properly resolved the remaining complications tied to her marriage with Alexander. She resolved, watching the stars emerge over the quiet town of Ashford Hollow, to formally begin the process of ending her marriage, not out of anger or bitterness, but out of genuine commitment to building an honest, fulfilling future for herself and her daughter. The formal request for divorce papers arrived at the palace on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday morning, delivered by courier directly to Alexander's study, where he sat reviewing council reports that had grown increasingly hostile in tone over recent weeks. He recognized Elena's careful handwriting on the accompanying letter immediately, and something inside him settled into a quiet, resigned acceptance even before he opened the envelope to read her words. She wrote plainly and without unnecessary emotion, explaining her decision to formally end their marriage, citing the irreparable breakdown of trust following his relationship with Charlotte and the birth of their son. She requested no financial settlement beyond what would reasonably support Isabel's upbringing, asked only that Alexander maintain honest, consistent communication regarding their daughter's future, and made clear that she had no intention of returning to palace life under any circumstances. Alexander read the letter twice, feeling the full weight of finality settle over him in a way that previous conversations, however difficult, had somehow not fully accomplished. He understood, reading her measured, deliberate words, that Elena had truly moved forward, had built a life separate from him that she had no intention of abandoning, regardless of whatever regret or reconciliation he might now be prepared to offer. He brought the letter to Margaret later that afternoon, watching his mother's expression carefully as she read through the formal request. To his surprise, she did not immediately launch into arguments about family reputation or practical considerations, but instead set the letter down slowly, her expression uncharacteristically thoughtful. "Perhaps this is for the best," Margaret finally said, her voice quieter than Alexander had expected. "I have watched this situation unfold for months now, Alexander, and I must admit, some responsibility lies with me as well. I encouraged choices that prioritized reputation over honesty, and the consequences of those choices have cost you a genuine, loving marriage." Alexander stared at his mother, surprised by this unexpected admission of fault. "You truly believe that now, after everything?" "I believe," Margaret said carefully, "that watching Elena leave this palace with such clear resolve, and hearing how she has built a stable, honest life for herself and Isabel without any assistance from this family, has taught me something important about the kind of strength that comes from integrity rather than status. I was wrong to encourage you towards secrecy and calculated management of this situation. I am sorry for the role I played in bringing you to this point." It was a rare and significant admission from a woman who had spent decades prioritizing family reputation above nearly everything else, and Alexander found himself genuinely moved by his mother's uncharacteristic honesty, even as it arrived far too late to repair the damage already done to his marriage. Meanwhile, tensions within the council continued escalating as details of the situation became increasingly public despite the family's efforts to manage the narrative. Several council members openly questioned Alexander's judgment and fitness to eventually assume full leadership of the dukedom, citing his handling of both his marriage and his relationship with Charlotte as evidence of poor decision-making that could reflect poorly on the family's broader political standing. Alexander found himself facing formal questioning before the full council, required to answer directly for the choices that had led to such significant public scandal. He answered honestly, for perhaps the first time in this entire ordeal, acknowledging his mistakes without the careful political deflection his mother had once encouraged him to employ. "I made choices that prioritized old loyalties and family pressure over honesty with my wife," he stated plainly before the assembled council members. "Those choices have cost me a marriage I deeply valued, and they have created complicated circumstances for two innocent children who deserve better than the secrecy I allowed to define their early lives. I take full responsibility for these failures, and I am committed to ensuring both my children receive honest, consistent support and acknowledgement moving forward, regardless of the political complications this may create." His honest admission, delivered without the usual careful political maneuvering the council had come to expect from ducal leadership, surprised many present, and while some council members remained skeptical of his fitness for future leadership, others expressed cautious respect for his willingness to acknowledge failure so directly rather than continuing to hide behind calculated half-truths. In the weeks that followed, Alexander began the difficult process of rebuilding his relationship with Charlotte on more honest terms as well, no longer pursuing any romantic reconciliation, but committing instead to genuine co-parenting responsibilities for their son, whom Charlotte had named William. He visited regularly, contributed meaningfully to William's upbringing, and worked to ensure the boy would grow up understanding his place within the family without the confusion and secrecy that had once seemed inevitable. He also began writing more regularly to Alina, though he carefully respected the boundaries she had established, focusing his letters primarily on questions about Isabel's development and gentle offers of financial or practical support should she ever need assistance. Alina's responses remained polite but measured, providing updates about Isabel's growth while maintaining clear distance regarding any possibility of personal reconciliation between them. Alexander found himself, during quiet evenings alone in his study, reflecting deeply on the person he had become throughout this entire ordeal, and the person he hoped to become moving forward. He recognized with painful clarity that his willingness to prioritize family expectations and political convenience over honest communication had cost him the genuine love and trust of a woman who had once believed in him completely. He resolved, even without any expectation of reconciliation, to become a better father to both his children, and a more honest, transparent leader as he prepared to eventually assume full responsibility for the dukedom. Word eventually reached Alina, through occasional letters and second-hand reports from Henry Cross, who maintained gentle correspondence with her despite her departure from palace life, that Alexander had genuinely changed in the months following her departure, that he had taken full public responsibility for his failures rather than hiding behind calculated political management, and that he had committed himself sincerely to co-parenting both Isabel and William with consistency and genuine care. Alina read these updates with a complicated mixture of emotions. She felt genuine relief that Alexander seemed committed to being a present, honest father for Isabel, understanding how important that consistent presence would be for her daughter's future well-being. At the same time, she felt no lingering desire to reconsider reconciliation, having built a life in Ashford Hollow that felt increasingly stable, honest, and fulfilling, particularly given her deepening relationship with Daniel. She and Daniel had grown closer during the months since Isabel's birth, their relationship progressing slowly and carefully, built on the patient honesty Daniel had promised from the very beginning. He had become a consistent, gentle presence in both Alina's and Isabel's daily lives, never pressuring Alina toward decisions she was not ready to make, simply offering steady support and genuine partnership as she continued rebuilding her sense of independence and self-worth. "You seem lighter lately," Sophie observed one evening, watching Alina laugh freely while Daniel played gently with Isabel in the small garden behind the house. "Happier than I have seen you in a very long time." "I feel lighter," Alina admitted, watching Daniel's patient, tender interaction with her daughter with quiet affection. "I think I am finally beginning to understand what genuine happiness feels like, built on honesty rather than obligation or careful political calculation." As autumn gave way to another winter in Ashford Hollow, Alina finalized the legal proceedings ending her marriage to Alexander, a process that concluded with surprising civility given the painful circumstances that had originally led to their separation. Alexander did not contest any of Alina's requests, ensuring generous, consistent financial support for Isabel while formally acknowledging Alina's full custody and independence moving forward. With the formal legal separation finally complete, Alina felt a profound sense of closure, allowing her to fully embrace the new chapter of her life without the lingering weight of unresolved obligations to her previous marriage. She looked toward the future with genuine hope, grateful for the strength she had discovered within herself throughout this difficult journey, and increasingly confident in the honest, loving life she was building alongside Daniel and her daughter Isabel. 2 years passed quietly and steadily in Ashford Hollow, each season bringing small but meaningful changes to the life Alina had built for herself and her daughter. Isabel had grown into a bright, curious toddler, her laughter filling the small home Alina now shared with Daniel, who had proposed marriage the previous spring in a simple, heartfelt gesture that felt entirely different from the grand, formal proposal Alexander had once offered years earlier within the palace's ornate gardens. Alina had said yes without hesitation, recognizing in Daniel exactly the kind of honest, consistent partnership she had once believed impossible to find. Their wedding had been small and intimate, held in Sophie's garden surrounded by close friends from the community who had welcomed Alina so warmly during her most vulnerable days. There had been no grand palace, no hundreds of watching guests, no carefully managed public image to maintain, simply genuine joy shared among people who truly cared for one another. Alexander had continued honoring his commitment to co-parenting Isabel, visiting regularly throughout the year, always respectful of the boundaries Alina and Daniel had established, always focused entirely on building a genuine relationship with his daughter rather than pursuing any personal reconciliation with Alina. Isabel had grown to know her father through these consistent visits, understanding him as a caring presence in her life, even as she also embraced Daniel's steady, loving role within their small family. On a bright spring afternoon, as Alina watched Isabel chase butterflies through the garden while Daniel worked nearby tending to a small vegetable patch they had started together, she found herself reflecting on the long journey that had brought her to this moment of genuine peace and happiness. She thought back to that devastating night at the palace gala, the letter that had shattered her previous understanding of her marriage, the difficult months of uncertainty and heartbreak that had followed. She had not known, during those darkest days, whether she possessed the strength necessary to rebuild her life entirely from nothing, whether leaving the security and status of palace life would prove to be a foolish, impulsive decision she might come to regret. Yet standing here now, watching her daughter's joyful laughter fill the warm spring air, feeling Daniel's steady presence nearby, Alina understood with complete certainty that leaving had been the bravest and most important decision of her entire life. She had learned throughout this difficult journey that genuine strength was not measured by titles or status, or the ability to maintain a carefully polished public image. True strength lay in the courage to walk away from comfortable lies in pursuit of honest, if more difficult, truth. It lay in the willingness to rebuild an entire life from uncertain beginnings, trusting that integrity and genuine effort could create something far more valuable than any inherited status or palace security ever could. Alexander, too, had continued growing throughout these 2 years, gradually earning back some of the council's trust through consistent, honest leadership, as he prepared to formally assume the full responsibilities of the dukedom. He had become a devoted father to both Isabel and William, ensuring both children understood their connection to each other as siblings, working carefully to build genuine relationships between them despite the complicated circumstances of their births. Margaret, too, had softened considerably over the intervening years, her rigid focus on family reputation gradually giving way to a more genuine appreciation for honesty and authentic relationships, influenced significantly by witnessing Alina's courage and the genuine happiness she had built for herself away from palace life. She had in recent months begun reaching out occasionally to Alina directly, small gestures of reconciliation that Alina accepted cautiously but with growing warmth, understanding that even complicated family relationships could evolve toward healthier patterns given genuine effort and time. On this particular spring afternoon, as Alina finished helping Daniel with the last of the planting, Isabel ran toward them both, her small hands clutching a bouquet of wildflowers she had gathered from the edges of the garden. "For you, Mama," she said proudly, holding the slightly crushed but earnestly gathered flowers toward Alina with an expression of pure, uncomplicated joy. Alina knelt down to accept the flowers, pulling her daughter into a warm embrace, feeling her heart swell with gratitude for the life she had built, for the daughter who filled her days with genuine joy, for the partner who had shown her what honest, patient love truly looked like. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said softly. "They are beautiful." Daniel joined them, wrapping his arms gently around both Alina and Isabel, and for a long, peaceful moment, the three of them simply stood together in the warm spring sunlight, surrounded by the simple garden they had built together, entirely removed from the palace intrigue and calculated political maneuvering that had once defined Alina's daily existence. That evening, after Isabel had been tucked safely into bed, Alina sat with Daniel on their small porch, watching the stars slowly emerge over the quiet town that had become her true home. She thought about the winding, difficult path that had brought her to this moment, the painful betrayal that had once seemed like the end of everything she valued, but which had instead become the beginning of a far more authentic, fulfilling life than she had ever imagined possible. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel asked quietly, his arm wrapped comfortably around her shoulders, leaving everything behind, starting over from nothing. Alina considered the question carefully before answering, though she already knew with complete certainty exactly how she felt. "Not for a single moment," she said softly. "Leaving the palace was not losing everything, Daniel. It was finally gaining everything that truly matters: honesty, genuine love, a life built on my own strength rather than someone else's carefully managed expectations. I would make that same choice again, without hesitation, every single time." Daniel pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, and Alina leaned into his warmth, feeling completely at peace with the extraordinary journey that had led her to this quiet, honest life. She thought of Isabel sleeping peacefully inside, of the genuine family she had built through courage and resilience rather than inherited titles or palace walls, and felt profound gratitude for every difficult step that had brought her to this moment of genuine, uncomplicated happiness. The Duchess, who had once stood trembling in a palace study, holding a letter that shattered her entire world, had transformed completely into a woman defined not by any royal title, but by her own hard-won strength, her unwavering commitment to honesty, and her deep, abiding love for the family she had built entirely on her own terms. Whatever challenges the future might still hold, Elena faced them now not as a sheltered Duchess dependent on palace protection, but as a strong, independent woman who had proven, through every difficult choice along the way, that genuine happiness could be built from even the most painful beginnings, provided one possessed the courage to choose honesty over comfortable illusion, every single time it truly mattered. Years later, Isabel would grow up hearing the story of her mother's courage told not as a tale of bitterness or lingering anger, but as a story of quiet strength and honest choices. Elena made certain of this, careful never to speak of Alexander with resentment in front of their daughter, always emphasizing instead the importance of honesty, self-respect, and the courage required to build a genuine life even when the easier path might have meant staying silent and accepting comfortable lies. Isabel grew close to her half-brother William over the years, the two children forming a genuine bond during their regular visits together, neither carrying the burden of secrecy that had once threatened to define their early lives. Alexander made certain both children understood their connection clearly and honestly from a young age, ensuring neither felt like a hidden secret or an inconvenient political arrangement, but rather as siblings genuinely valued within their complicated but ultimately honest family structure. Margaret, in her later years, became an unexpectedly warm presence in Isabel's life, her earlier rigid focus on reputation and status gradually replaced by genuine affection for her grandchildren and growing respect for Elena's independent strength. She often told Isabel stories about her mother's remarkable courage, admitting openly, in ways she never could have imagined doing during Elena's difficult departure from the palace, that Elena's decision to leave had ultimately taught the entire family invaluable lessons about the true cost of prioritizing appearances over honesty. Elena and Daniel's small family continued growing over the following years, welcoming a second child, a son they named Oliver, whose arrival brought even greater joy to their already happy household. Daniel remained exactly the steady, honest partner he had promised to be from their very first conversations, and Elena often reflected on how differently her life had unfolded from what she had once imagined during her palace years, and how grateful she remained for that unexpected, difficult, but ultimately transformative change of direction. The small clinic where Daniel worked eventually expanded under his careful leadership, becoming an important resource for the entire Ashford Hollow community, with Elena taking on increasing responsibility for its administration as the years passed. She found genuine fulfillment in this meaningful work, a stark contrast to the purely ceremonial duties that had once defined her role within palace life. Occasionally, Elena would receive updates about palace affairs, about Alexander's continued growth as a more honest, transparent leader who had earned back significant respect from the council through years of consistent, principled governance, following the painful lessons of his earlier mistakes. She felt genuine satisfaction hearing of his growth, understanding that their painful shared history had ultimately led both of them toward more authentic versions of themselves, even as their paths had diverged so completely from the future they had once imagined sharing together. On quiet evenings, watching her children grow within the honest, loving home she had built with Daniel, Elena often thought back to that devastating night when a single letter had shattered her understanding of her marriage and her future. She no longer felt anger when remembering that painful discovery, only a quiet, grateful understanding that sometimes the most devastating moments in life ultimately clear the path towards something far more genuine and fulfilling than anything previously imagined. She had left the palace as a heartbroken duchess, uncertain and afraid of the unknown future awaiting her beyond those grand, familiar walls. She had become, through years of courage, hard work, and unwavering commitment to honesty, a woman entirely secure in her own strength, surrounded by genuine love built without secrets or careful political calculation. It was, she often reflected, a far greater legacy than any royal title could ever have provided, one she felt profoundly grateful to pass on to her children as they continued growing within the honest, loving family she had fought so hard to build. And so, in the quiet town of Ashford Hollow, far removed from palace intrigue and calculated political maneuvering, Alina Hartley finally found the genuine happiness she had once believed impossible, proving through every difficult choice along her extraordinary journey that true strength lies not in maintaining comfortable illusions, but in the courage to choose honesty, integrity, and authentic love, no matter how difficult that path may initially appear.